This video is brought to you by Rise of Kingdoms. Hey noble ones, welcome back to my channel. This is the Metatron speaking, and today we're talking about the ancient Egyptian armies. And that's not why I'm wearing a medieval helmet. I'm wearing a medieval helmet because that's what I've got. I don't have anything ancient Egypt related. Yet. Every time we think about the ancient Egyptians, there are, I'm sure, many things that come to mind. I mean, they were amazing from a cultural standpoint, architectural standpoint, their religion, but their armies were important too. We know that the Egyptians were masters of war. And yet, here's a question I've got for you. If you were to close your eyes right now, could you imagine what an ancient Egyptian army looked like? What sort of soldiers did they have? What weapons did they use? What were their tactics? Clearly, this is a topic that is so deep that it needs to be divided into manageable chunks, meaning episodes. You could easily make one single episode fully dedicated to war chariots. Even two, if you think about the fact that we could also talk about chariots in a comparative key. For example, looking at how chariots were used by Celtic cultures instead. You could make a video on the composite bow. You get the gist. But for today, we have a general introduction to the idea of what an Egyptian army looked like, the ancient Egyptian armed forces. Just like when we study ancient Roman history on this channel, one of the most important things to do is to put a time stamp. What period are we talking about? If we were to talk about the ancient Roman army, we would have to talk about first the kingdom, then the republic, possibly dividing it into early republic and late republic, then the imperial time or the principate, the dominate, so the late empire. We will have a very similar approach with Egyptian armies. We will begin by talking about the Old Kingdom, then the Middle Kingdom, and then the New Kingdom. Now, if you are fascinated by Egypt, its mysteries, history, culture, weapons, soldiers, then Rise of Kingdoms is a game you can't miss. Rise of Kingdoms is a popular free-to-play cross-platform strategy game with over 100 million players worldwide. The game is available on both mobile and PC. In Rise of Kingdoms, you can choose between 13 historical civilizations, recruit hundreds of historical generals, train the special soldiers of each civilization, progress to the next era, collect resources, develop technologies, and build your own dream city. We now have the new Egyptian civilization joining the ongoing war. This brand new civilization comes with powerful troops and sophisticated heroes. And if you like historical Egypt, you are going to love both the heroes available, such as Thutmose III, Cleopatra, and the great priest Imhotep, and the buildings and architecture, as you'll be able to build pyramids, sun temples, and even Greco-Roman buildings. For war and strategy, you'll have access to the distinctive Egyptian bowmen and higher research speed. The graphics are brightly coloured and cartoonish, the battles are fun, and you have a huge map to explore, 1.44 million square kilometers. The game also has a morning and evening system. Click the link in the description to download the game now and use the gift code 22ROKEgypt to get incredible resources. By participating in the in-game community events, new and current players will have a chance to win a round-trip ticket to Egypt. And big thanks to Rise of Kingdoms for sponsoring my video.
Egypt awakens. Chaos awaits.
When we look at ancient Egypt, three are the great forces that shaped the life of the ancient Egyptians: bureaucracy, the priesthood, and the military. Whenever we try and understand or explore a people of the past and their characteristics, we need to look at evidence, either primary or secondary. When it comes to survived primary evidence pertaining to the Egyptian army, we find it in the form of detailed battle descriptions on the walls of temples and sometimes on the walls of soldiers' tombs. Initially, there was no permanent standing army, with the only exception being a small sort of royal bodyguard corps. So the first approach that we see in the Old Kingdom is that of conscription, periodically conscripted young men that were sent on military campaigns, in a way similar to how initially Rome organized its armies. These local corps will be supplied by provincial officials. Now, when it comes to the military hierarchy, we do find the title Overseer of Soldiers, and other times the title Overseer of Desert Blockhouses and Royal Fortresses. But all we know when it comes to the division of the army is the term battalion. By the first intermediate period, Each local governor was entitled to recruit his own private army. Of course, all of these private governor volunteer armies would all get together under the command of the pharaoh when needed. Now, regardless of the fact that the Old Kingdom kind of army was not a professional standing army, that doesn't mean that we should consider these armies to be primitive. The variety in weapons available to these soldiers also speaks of their resourcefulness. Shields, spears, daggers, maces, cudgels, and of course bows and arrows would be the main. It is during the Middle Kingdom that we start seeing a more ambitious and systematic approach to military organization. One of the first that we see in this case is found in the Nubian policy of Amenemhat I. But as we progress into the Middle Kingdom, the power of singular governors starts to decline in favor of the more professional and highly organized royal army Nubia. Much of this information comes from the papyri found under the granaries of the temple of Ramses II at Thebes. One of the main differences with the Old Kingdom is the now presence of a very complex chain of command from commander down to infantryman, and we read titles in Egyptians translating as head commander of the town regiment, soldier of the town regiment, commander of the leaders of dog patrols, scribe of the army, and much more. That, paired together with a much more intricate and well-organized series of fortresses and outposts, speaks to the enhancement and progress of military organization. But the establishment of a large professional army happened in the New Kingdom. This also brought somewhat of a shift towards the power of the military over the other classes. An Egyptian army would now count up to 5,000 soldiers, and you would have both professionals and conscripts. Each division in the army would be named after a god, most likely a deity linked to the area of provenance of said unit. For instance, Ammon, rich of bows, to represent a battalion of archers. The basic military unit was the platoon, 50 infantrymen under the command of a chief of 50. Chariot warriors and elite troops would then support and reinforce the basic infantry soldiers. The king and his generals would represent the council, whom would dictate strategy. Even though we don't know a lot about the way these soldiers were trained, we do understand that in the New Kingdom, fully fledged training camps existed. Regular physical exercise, continuous drill, and punishment being the key. And through the depictions of soldiers engaging in some sort of wrestling also speaks to the idea of the physical training not only being weapon-based, but possibly also hand-in-hand based. Images also tend to represent these New Kingdom's camps as being completely surrounded by a barricade of shield, including also stables for horses and cattle. It is also believed that a lot of professional soldiers would begin training as children. When talking about weapons, we see a somewhat predictable sort of development. We go from copper weapons to bronze to iron. During the entirety of the dynastic period, one of the most common weapons associated to infantry, and this might surprise you, was the axe. Axes during the Old and Middle Kingdom had this semicircular shape that would be made of copper, and they would be attached by cords to a wooden handle, and these cords will go through perforations in the copper and then will be attached on lugs. At this period, there wasn't really very much difference between a common worker's axe and a battlefield axe. In the Middle Kingdom, however, some battle axes had longer blades with concave sides narrowing down to a curved edge. As we reach the New Kingdom, the blades of axes become longer and straighter, probably for better penetration. Now, usually you know that on this channel we talk about the importance of spears. And yes, spearmen existed in the ancient Egyptian army. But first and foremost, the first thing we need to keep in mind is the fact that spears at this time were more considered as something that was supposed to be thrown at the enemy. But what's interesting is that, again, we see a developmental path when it comes to the materials and the way these spearheads were made and connected to the shafts as we go through the kingdoms. In the Old and Middle Kingdom, axes start being made of flint, then of copper. But as we reach the New Kingdom, now most axe blades are made of bronze. And even though both the flint examples and the copper examples were connected to wooden handles by tangs, in the New Kingdom these bronze heads are usually connected by sockets. But another kind of interesting hybrid weapon that was used at this time was again, hybrid between an axe and a spear. It kind of worked a little bit in a way like a Japanese naginata. The popularity of daggers grew exponentially in the Middle Kingdom as a weapon that was more of a backup weapon for really close quarter combat situations. It was of course double-edged, and early examples before the New Kingdom would have had a handle of bone or ivory. Now when it comes to long range, of course the sling and the plated sling were both used, but the bow and arrow reigned supreme. There is a huge difference though. In the pre-dynastic period, when we need to imagine the bows, we're talking about very rudimental early so-called horn bows, which were made of two separate bones, usually antelope bones, that were connected through a central wooden core. But as we reach the dynastic period, now archers are using what is called a self-bow. It was entirely made of wooden frame, and it could come in two possible shapes: curved or straight, firing reed arrows fletched with 3 feathers and tipped with flint or hardwood. The points will later become bronze. At this time, the time of the New Kingdom, the bow becomes finally the composite bow. But as I was saying, that one would require its own dedicated video. Probably one of the greatest innovations of the New Kingdom is the usage of war chariots. The typical Egyptian chariot consisted of a light wooden semicircular framework with an open back. The wheels, usually about 1 meter in diameter, were meticulously assembled from small pieces of wood and bound together with leather. 2 horses were then yoked by a long pole attached to the center of the axle. Each chariot will be then manned by 2 men. One would be the driver in a way, and the other one will be the warrior, usually equipped with a spear, a bow, and a shield. The chariot not only was important when it comes to tactical and strategic operations, but it also entered the royal regalia, and we know that it was a representation of power and aristocracy, so much so that even the pharaoh at this time starts to be represented on top of a chariot. Armor is a very interesting topic. When we look at the Old Kingdom and the Middle Kingdom, there is no armor. So when we are looking at the infantry, they are not covered. Generally speaking, we go from seeing people dressed just like workers would at the time, so basically just having a belt and a loincloth, to sometimes having some sort of linen protection for the shoulders, but no armor. That is the ubiquitous description and representation of the forces when it comes to infantry. Now when it comes to bowmen, archers, the situation changes. They're usually represented in what seem to be slightly more sturdy red and green garments, but even though these might have been made of leather rather than linen, still no armor. I think one of the reasons comes to the fact that the shield at this time was the primary line of defense. And also you have to consider that we are very much predating anything Roman still at this time. Some people even brought up the idea that perhaps one of the reasons why Egyptian armies initially didn't have much armor was the climate. But I personally disagree with that. First of all, because we know that when for example, Knights Crusaders went to fight in Jerusalem and in the Middle East, they still kept their armor. Given Middle Eastern climate is probably not as hot as Africa, but still, I don't think the climate is the reason, because as we get closer to the actual and we enter the actual classical period, look at the Carthaginians. They are as much northern Africans as the Egyptians are. In fact, Carthage would basically be modern-day Tunisia, and yet Carthaginian soldiers wore basically as much armor as the Romans did during the times of the Punic Wars. So I don't think that the answer is the climate. Also because as we reach the New Kingdom, we'll see that armor starts to be incorporated into the infantry corps. I believe it's more of an approach. As I say, the shields worked. They were very big, between 1 to 1.5 meters long. They were usually tapered at the top, get more of an edge, if you will. They usually consisted of a wooden frame covered with a sturdy cow's hide. They're usually decorated and painted. I think probably together with the manpower that was available to the pharaoh and local governors were considered to be enough. If you lose some men, you just replace them. But also because the kind of enemies that the Egyptians were fighting were also not wearing armor at this time, so it was just a different period. But as we enter the New Kingdom, armor starts to appear, and the first sort of armor that we see consists of bronze scales sewn onto linen back garments. Sometimes these small scales of bronze could also be sewn onto leather rather than linen. Now when it comes to helmets, it's very strange, but the helmets do remain rare. We do see some helmets, particularly in the New Kingdoms, so are usually associated with aristocracy. In fact, one of the most common ones is a leather framework with metal discs that is usually called the blue crown. Also, as armor becomes more common, shields become smaller, but that's something we also see happening in European warfare. One last aspect that I would like to cover is mercenaries. It is from the early dynastic period that the Egyptian army used mercenaries. Now, some very famous include the Nubian mercenaries, but also the Medjay, a nomadic group originally from the eastern deserts of Nubia, were commonly employed as scouts and sometimes light infantry. As we go forward and progress in time, soldiers have more and more nationalities within the Egyptian army. We have got Syrians, Libyans, Sherden, Shekelesh, and even Hittites. Mercenaries is also a little bit of an umbrella term at this time. We shouldn't all consider all of them to be professional mercenaries that were paid. Sometimes these were prisoners that were given a chance at liberty or freedom through being drafted into the army. So again, even though we put them all under the term mercenary, there were many different types and very different situations. Okay, noble ones, but as a first introduction to the complexity of the Egyptian army through time, I think that this could be considered to be the end of this video. I hope that you enjoyed it, and if you did, please let me know and share it, because if the video gets a reasonable amount of success, I will continue the series and I will keep on making these videos, but only if you're interested in them. Also, don't forget to click the link in the description below to take advantage of the amazing offer from Rise of Kingdoms. Thank you very much for watching, and remember, the Metatron has spread his wings. Goodbye.